So it is now with great honor, but much deeper appreciation, that I would like to introduce our featured keynote speaker for the 7th Annual Community for Excellence Partner Summit. Torie Weiston-Serdan is a scholar and practitioner with over 13 years of teaching and youth programming experience. An emerging leader in the youth mentoring field, she wrote Critical Mentoring, a Practical Guide, which has become the handbook for culturally sustaining youth work in the discipline. Outside of teaching and research, Weiston-Serdan runs the Youth Mentoring Action Network, a nonprofit dedicated to leveraging justice and equity mentoring. Through her community-based work, she mentors Inland Empire youth through high school to into college and careers. She also works extensively with other community-based organizations in support of their youth advocacy efforts, specializing in training mentors to work with diverse populations, Black, Latinx, LGBTQ, first-generation college students, and low-income youth. As a scholar, she examines how marginalized and minoritized youth are served by mentoring and youth development programs. Weiston-Serdan currently serves on the Big Brothers Big Sisters LGBTQ National Advisory Council and the research board of the National Mentoring Research Center. Please share in my supreme excitement to welcome Torie Weiston-Serdan into our space today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Herman, for that amazing introduction. I wish I had hype music right now. But I appreciate being just accepted into the space. I appreciate the connection that has been made with everyone who's on the planning committee and all the effort, all the work that y'all have done to put together this amazing event. I got to start my timer because once I start talking, y'all, I don't know what's going to happen. So I just start my timer so I can remind myself that I do have a limit here. But again, just really want to continue to give the shout out and extend my thankfulness for everyone who's here, for everyone who thought through this whole concept of critical mass, which is dope, for everyone who, again, just put in the hours organizing this event, pulling me in, making sure that everything was on point. And again, just the passion around the work, which you cannot ask for more than that when you put something out in the world than to have people truly embrace it and apply it and use it in ways that you hadn't even imagined, right? So again, shout out, appreciation to everyone here. I've been thinking a lot about this presentation, what I might want to say, what I might want to do. Every time I get asked to do a talk or a keynote, I kind of think about all the bells and whistles, especially in today's Zoom technology. Should I do this? Should I do that? Should it look like a training? Should it look like a workshop? And the one thing that I love about keynotes is the flexibility of really being able to speak from the heart. And that's what I'm going to do today. I did plan. So, and the folks on the planning committee will attest to that. We did plan. But I think, one of the things that I said to them, even as we were planning, is that I have to move in the way that the Spirit takes me, right? And really think about what needs to be said. What should we be hearing? What should we be doing? What direction should we be going? And I think one of the key things that I always do, and I do this even with the concept of critical mentoring, is start with context. We have to start with where we are. We have to start with what we're experiencing. And I think of two very important issues that we're dealing with in this moment: racial justice and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think about the intersections thereof, right? The moment that we are in sort of begs us to think about what we have been doing and what we haven't been taking care of and who we have not been taking care of. The moment that we are in is a critical one. And again, the idea of critical mass is important here. It's a moment it's a historic moment. It's a moment that we stand in and we have these choices to make, and we have these very sort of hefty projects to contend with. We have history to continue in, history to make, history to create. And I'm not sure that we are all really, truly recognizing the urgency of this moment. I know that some of us feel more woke today than we did yesterday. I know that some of us are feeling a little more energized than we did yesterday. There's a little more activism in all of us, maybe today than there was yesterday, but the urgency of this moment really calls for a lot of that we have to get off the fence, right? It calls for dismissing sort of that hesitancy and really stepping into this moment. The COVID-19 pandemic, and I don't have to give you guys the statistics, right, has been devastating to everything from the idea that we are now on Zoom having a conference that historically has been held in person, right? That we are doing this on digital forms because we don't have a choice. We cannot be physically in community with one another. That alters the course of our work already. Folks that we know are not only getting sick, some of us have lost folks. Many of us have lost folks that we know. My mom, who's an RN, actually had COVID-19 and was hospitalized. It was a devastating, moment for our family, and worrying, considering that my mom is older, that she is, not the healthiest, and we were really concerned that she may not be able to live through COVID-19. Thankfully, she did. She is a COVID-19 survivor. But the idea that we even have those words, COVID-19 survivor, right? I have a student who contacted me Wednesday night and said, I lost my grandmother today. She got COVID-19 and her body just could not take it, right, at her age. And so I'm thinking about all of the loss that we've experienced. And I'm thinking about the way in which the virus has been politicized and how folks have felt like they've had to choose keeping themselves safe and their family safe, right? This is a backdrop for the work that we're doing, right? Every time we turn on the news and we hear the count of COVID-19 infections and we hear the count of folks who have succumbed to COVID-19, and we think about what we could be doing as a society to have a better and more effective response. And then we have, which is not disconnected, we had what we call the Summer of Racial Justice. And that continues, right? Today, we had the protests, the riots, and I put that in quotes, right? We had the unrest that happened, and that really continues to happen as injustice continues in our country. We think about how that has sort of overlapped with this COVID-19 pandemic, that folks of color, that marginalized communities have been disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 virus, just as they have been negatively disproportionately impacted by so many of the negative things that are happening in our society, climate change, et cetera, right? So we have this backdrop, we have this sense of urgency, we have these two pandemics that are plaguing us, and they come from a long history of the lack of work that we have done, right? And it's not to dismiss that we haven't had fighters in our history, that justice fighters, equity fighters in our history that have gotten us to this fact. Or to this point, I do not want to dismiss them. But we do also have to recognize that we have not been doing enough when it comes to passing on to the next generation, that this sense of urgency is here because we need to do more. And so it's against this sort of backdrop that I want to think about what our next levels are, right? And I don't know, I think this is in the program somewhere, but the title of my talk is Next Levels, right? So hip hop all day, next levels, critical mentoring today and tomorrow. As I engage in my own work with young people, I'm always thinking about next levels. I'm always thinking about not just what will I do for young people, but what will young people do for themselves, and what will they do for the young people who are after them. Always thinking in future generations, always thinking about how can we get to next levels. And again, that context that we just talked about is important for thinking about next levels. When we lay the groundwork and say that given the context that we are in, given the sense of urgency that is now, we then also have to think about what is our next level of response. If what we have been doing has not been working, what is our next level of response? What is expected of us now? What will be expected of our young folks in the future? And how do we get ready? How do we begin as many indigenous communities think, how do we begin planning 7 years, 7 generations from now, right? Thinking about reimagining, freedom dreaming for a better future. One of the points that I have to raise that really considers next level, one sort of connected to a story. But one of these points is about our response to the pandemic versus our response to, what many activists are calling the racial justice summer. One of my young people, when we were having a talk online during that summer about what was going on, one of my young people said very explicitly and sharply, said to us on the call, why hasn't the state, the government, officials, right, people in authority, why haven't they given the same amount of attention in response to the COVID-19 pandemic as they have the protests? And we asked them to unpack that. What do you mean? Well, when the stay-at-home orders went in, nobody was policing that, right? No one was organizing to make sure that we stayed at home, that people weren't out, people were crowding places, people were, sort of not following the rules. But when people started protesting, you saw people in authority, they use the word people in authority, I'm going to use the word the state. You saw them organize. All of a sudden, there was a curfew. Everybody had to be in. You could see police kind of going around neighborhoods, making sure that people weren't out after a certain hour. There was a willingness to organize, and that the efficiency of the state became clear. And we have to ask ourselves then, especially, from that perspective of a young person, what are we willing to do, and what are we showing young folks that we are willing to do to keep them safe? When our response to their protests and to them using their voice is more organized, is more forceful than our response to keeping them safe, there's a problem, and it sends a very clear message. And in connection to this, a story that I want to tell from our friend who's currently in Ghana right now. We were talking on the phone, and she was explaining the process of going home. She has a home there. And she was explaining the process. She said, when we get off the airplane, or as we get off the airplane, we sanitize our hands. We take, the luggage that we brought on the airplane down the hall. We go to a station. We type in on an iPad where we've been and all of that information. We sanitize our hands again. We go to another section. We go to these cubicles in this section where they give us a COVID test, and we sanitize our hands again. And we go out into the sort of main area of the airport to pick up our luggage that was under the plane. Again, we're sanitizing the whole way. By the time we get our luggage, they have our COVID-19 test results. If we are negative, welcome to Ghana. You can go out into the country. If you are positive, they will escort you to one of their designated hotels where you will be fed and housed, of course, at your cost. But you will be quarantined for 2 weeks before they let you go into Ghana. The organization in that, from a country that our country does not recognize as equal. I won't use the stereotypical terms that we typically apply to African countries, but the effectiveness of organizing the state in a way that maintains health and keeps folks protected. Look at the way in which we chose to organize our state, and look at the way that Ghana chose to organize their state, and look at the intentions behind the two. More context, but also thinking about next levels and what's possible. Young people notice those things. And so when we talk about critical mentoring, one of the things that I really note is about listening to young people, learning from young people, recognizing that young people have a lot to offer us, right? And that was a lesson that young person on that call taught all of us in terms of how they see the world and in terms of how the world presents itself to this particular young person. Critical mentoring asks us to not only consider context, but to critically interrogate context, to think very consciously and intentionally about race, class, sexuality, gender, ability. It requires that we get uncomfortable thinking about other people's experiences. It requires that we get uncomfortable interrogating our history. It requires that we get uncomfortable sort of challenging and dismantling systems. It requires that we act. One of the complicated things around critical mentoring that folks have a hard time wrapping their heads around is that it is not passive mentoring at all. It is not about showing up on a Saturday, kicking a soccer ball around the field with a young person, maybe buying them ice cream or, taking them out to eat. Those are very nice things. We appreciate folks who do that. But critical mentoring asks us to take things to the next level. It says that if young people exist, as we all do, in a context where the water and air that we breathe and drink are toxic, that we have to start taking steps to purify the air and to purify the water, that it is not okay for us to ask young people to adapt to the toxicity that we exist in. And this is a challenge for us as adults, because we are consistently sort of begging young people to adapt to all of the terrible things that we've adapted to. My teacher is mean to me. I don't feel comfortable in that class. I don't feel safe in that class. Our response is often, well, you're not going to like everybody you have to work with. You're not going to always like your boss. You just got to suck it up and deal with it. Some of that is okay advice in terms of teaching, sort of a level of resilience, but not really thinking about what that young person is having to navigate every day to access an education, and not considering that that is a really toxic context, and then not helping them to learn coping mechanisms, or even helping them strategize around ways to disrupt those systems is problematic. Because what we're saying is, we suffered when we learned, so you have to suffer too. We suffered as we came of age, so you have to suffer too. Not all of that suffering and trauma that we've experienced is healthy. And young folks are beginning to take us to task and say, well, just because you suffered while you learned, and just because learning had to be difficult and arduous, and you had to walk 5 miles uphill both ways to school, does not mean that I should have to do it. We're in 2020, we have technology, right? And so we do. And thank you, Herman, for dropping that. We normalize the trauma. And we say, if you didn't sort of take you didn't go through anything, right? And I hear so many adults getting upset at young people. You guys are just weak. You guys can't tolerate anything, and not thinking about the ways that we have so adapted to toxicity and harm that we want to normalize that for the next generation. So we need to begin to listen to them more when they say, this is too difficult. This is too hard. It shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be. This is their ability to still dream. This is their ability to still reimagine. This is their ability to sort of check us and say, what you guys have been doing is not the most effective, efficient, healing, whole way to exist. And we need better, right? Instead of being sort of hurt by that, right? I was going to use some of the young people's language, but maybe not appropriate in the keynote. But instead of being, sort of triggered by that, we need to think more critically again and more consciously about what they are asking us to do in terms of reconfiguring these systems and rethinking, right, how we do our work, especially in education. And critical mentoring asks us to do that. Critical mentoring requires that we begin partnering with young people, collaborating with young people, being in community with young people in a way that says, we understand that the water and the air that we are breathing and drinking is toxic. And we are not asking you to adapt. We are supporting you, right? And participating, collaborating, being alongside you as we all do the work of clearing this toxicity, of purifying the air and purifying the water. Critical mentoring asks us to take that next step. It asks us to act, right? It is next levels in terms of what basic sort of mentoring practice has typically asked of us. And in thinking about, particularly about being youth-centric, and I think this is important for all of us really in this audience because of the work that we do, we cannot tokenize young people. Whenever I talk about critical mentoring, folks, they love the youth-centric part, right? They kind of want to skip past the race, class, sexuality, all that. They want to skip past the hard stuff and they want to boom. Well, we can be youth-centric. We can have young folks on the panel. We can bring young folks into the space. The problem is that the first part of critical mentoring asks us to do our own work, right? It asks us to grapple with these issues so that we can prepare ourselves to have young people in our spaces and not do harm to them. So when we talk about the aspect of critical mentoring that says be youth-centric, what we're talking about is first challenging our own adultism and our old antiquated ideas and values, checking those and thinking about how we can really get behind young people as they do the critical work, right? And it's not to dismiss that they don't need, it's not to say that they don't need elders in the room, because that's the other argument folks always give me. Well, they still need to learn things. Of course they do. They still need elders in the room. They don't need elders in the room talking down to them. They don't need elders in the room talking at them. They don't need elders in the room who are not willing to freedom dream alongside them. And they definitely don't need elders in the room who are going to get in the way of progress. So until we have done our work, and understanding how we can be most supportive and resourceful, right, for young folks, then we shouldn't be in those spaces. Because being youth-centric is not just inviting young people into the room. It's about listening to them when they speak. It's about following their lead when they have the better ideas, right? When they are ready to disrupt in ways that we aren't because we got bills to pay. Let me just pause on that one. Because capitalism is very much, we are rooted in capitalism, right? It's a necessity. It's the world we live in, right? But we always want to be radical until, right? ... And I'll let you fill that in. But when we are challenged in ways that, I don't want to lose my job, I don't want to lose this paycheck, which is, I'm not hating, it's a necessity. We all got to live, right? But if you think about how that has functioned in history, this is why young people have always been at the heart of our movements, because they have had less they have been less tied to capitalism in a lot of ways, being students, maybe not having to think about it. I think all the way back to the Children's March of the Civil Rights Movement, when so many adults just stopped engaging in the civil rights movement for fear that they would lose their jobs, they wouldn't be able to take care of their families, right? They couldn't get anyone to march in the street. And do you know what young people did? Young people took the risk because they had less in terms of political capital, they had less to lose. They weren't going to lose jobs, right? They weren't employed yet. So they did a lot of the work that we as adults were not able to do. We need to begin to value that and respect that. And we need to be able to build capacity, I think, for that as well. And that's another level also of being youth-centric. We have to think about how do we compensate young people for the very real labor that they are doing to educate us all, to bring us into the 21st century, to challenge our thinking on a lot of the issues that we are still sort of stuck in the past around. How do we resource them, right? My current thinking right now is all about, and this is really into the next sort of section of this keynote, is really all about how do I power youth activism? What kind of space am I creating to make sure that young folks are getting the information, education, resources, support, money, what do they need to make the world a better place, since we know that a lot of this responsibility is on them? So how can I show up as an elder in a way that, yes, supports them, that, you know, that I can talk to them and I can wrap my arms around them, yes, but how can I also show up? How can I leverage the capital that I do have? How can I leverage the power that I do have? How can I navigate spaces that maybe they can't navigate to ensure that they have access to those spaces? How can I bring them into rooms they were never invited to, right? How am I powering the next generation? How am I powering youth activism? And I think for me, and I'll try to sort of, this is my sort of last section. I think for me, that's our call to action. And thinking about what we need to do now, that's really our call to action. I mean, we've talked about sort of interrogating our current context, being honest about that, really thinking critically about the institutions that we currently exist in, how we have learned to navigate them, how young people are challenging that, and how we need to sort of understand all this so that we can support them, right? How do we center young people so we can hear their voices very clearly? And how do we be the support that they need, right? How do we make sure that they have what I call voice, power, and choice, right? Not just a seat at the table, but voice, power, and choice. And then again, what are our next levels, right? What do we need to do now in this moment to be most effective, to ensure that young people have what they need to navigate society, to navigate our economy, to navigate higher ed spaces? And how do we begin partnering with them to do the reimagining that needs to be done to recreate what these spaces should look like? That is, I think, our most important next level. We have to think, and I know that sounds really simple, but and maybe it's just me, but I know that in my work, I don't see a lot of thoughtfulness. I hear a lot of talking. I see a lot of folks getting around the table saying what they gonna do, right? I don't see the thoughtfulness behind how do we move? When is it time to not move? When is it time to let young folks be the ones to move, right? Being thoughtful about our work, about how we set things up, how we set up programs, what our policies look like, not just how we support young people, but again, how do we subsidize their labor? How do we compensate them as they educate us and teach us? When I think about next levels, I think about Martin Luther King having been a mentor to Stokely Carmichael. I think about how Martin Luther King probably never could have imagined who Stokely Carmichael would have become and what kind of movement he would have launched, because it wasn't in his imagination, but there was still a thoughtfulness in supporting the next generation of activists, even though they may not have agreed with the direction that the next generation of activists were going, right? And I'm not dismissing that there was conflict. We know historically that there was conflict, but we also know that there was a care and thoughtfulness in training young people and giving them the tools that we knew how to use. And I think it was the young people who then took the next step and demanded that after we gave them the tools, we then get out of the way and we let them remix the work that we just passed down. And that is, I think, the thoughtfulness and the patience and the strategy that elders are going to have to move with. Now that we are elders, now that we are the folks that have sort of navigated these spaces and gotten to where we are, we've got to think about not just representation. It's not just about opening doors and letting folks in. It's about thinking of how they are going to thrive when they get here, how they're going to shift things for the next generation. We're talking next levels. That takes intention. That takes thoughtfulness. That takes strategy. That requires healing. and this is another issue I hadn't even planned to talk about, but I'm glad. It requires healing. It requires for so many of us to do the healing that we need to do after having been traumatized by these institutions, so that we can show up in spaces as healthy and whole individuals to let young people do the work that needs to be done. We're getting in the way because we're triggered and we're traumatized, and we haven't done our work. This is back to this man. Okay, so let me chill. How much? Okay, I got 16 minutes. I get excited, y'all, but this is the work, right? We haven't done our own work. You know why we're giving young people answers like get over it? You know why we're giving young people answers like that's what I went through, you got to go through it too. You got to pay your dues, because we're triggered and we're traumatized. And we haven't done the healing work that we require so we can show up for them in whole ways. This is our work. When we talk about next levels, and this is, I got to give you guys some context here. I spent some time last summer, or the summer before, I'm sorry, the pandemic time is getting me. I spent some time in Ghana working on my second book. And so much of the work that we did there, I was on a writing retreat with 6 Black women, and we spent 2.5 weeks in Ghana just doing our work. There was so much ancestor work that we talked about. It's had an impact on the way that I'm thinking about what the future should look like. Because when I experienced firsthand now being on the same soil as my ancestors and actually going to sites of trauma where my ancestors endured so much, suffered so much, right? Then I started thinking about their connection to my grandmother, to my mother, to my aunt who had just passed before I left to Ghana, to myself. And I started thinking about how all of that moves through me to the next generation of young people, and how what all of this moves through them to the next generation of folks after them. Our ancestors were always thinking next levels. They survived so that we could be. We move now, or should be moving now, in a way that doesn't just open doors, I will say that again, but that radically reimagines what's possible for the next generations after us. And we have to do some healing work to get there, because we've adapted and adjusted to toxicity. And now we're asking the next generation of young folks to survive. And I'm going to quote my sister, Bettina Love, where we should be creating spaces where young folks can thrive, because they need to do more than survive. That's what we've been doing. They deserve better. And so how do we get there? We got to do our own self-work. We have to be critically conscious. We have to start naming. We have to start calling out and calling in. We have to be a part of dismantling. And if we can't, we need to get out of the way and do what we can to support and uplift the young people who are willing to do the hard work, who are willing to challenge the ways that we need to move, who are willing to say, no, this needs to be torn down and we need to build something new in its place. We can't, this can't be anymore. We're here trying to justify it and hold up the vestiges of these institutions that have never served folks who look like us. For what? Ask yourself. Either because you benefit or because you're so traumatized that you no longer have the ability to freedom dream. But guess what? Our young folks have that ability. And if we can't, then the most supportive, the most loving, the most healing thing we can do is let them build. We are the bridge between our ancestors and our young folks. We need to begin sort of living that reality. We need to begin moving in that way. We need to be thinking beyond ourselves to next levels. Imagine what our institutions could be if we let our young folks reimagine and rebuild them, right? And I know that as abolitionists, and I see folks in the chat like, yes to Bettina Love, I know that as abolitionists, we do not have the luxury or the privilege to just dismantle and tear down. We have to be divesting, dismantling, and tear down, and building an alternative at the same time. We don't have the luxury of doing one or the other. And this is why thoughtfulness and strategic movements make sense, right? When we begin to talk about these issues of defunding and everyone's getting all wild about, oh, we can't defund. We're not really unpacking. We're not really thinking critically about what that means, right? For some folks, it doesn't go too far. Folks who are abolitionists are like, defund, we need to shut the whole thing down. I think defund is a middle ground. Because what the young folks are saying is, I want you to invest in me on the same level that you have been investing in my destruction. I want you to shift the resources from the investment that you're making and sending me to prison, right? And keeping me in debt and keeping me in a low wage job. I need you to shift the resources from that to investing in my college access, right? In my college education, to investing in jobs that make sense for the 21st century, right? To investing in spaces where I'm not going to be policed in ways, right, that disproportionately impact my Blackness, my queerness, me being Latinx, me being Indigenous, me being a woman, me being trans. Right? These are the issues that our young folks are asking us to confront, and our unwillingness to do so is really what's devastating. And it's because we have not done our own work, our own healing, our own restoration. And I think the other thing, and again, I'm really, I keep looking at my time. But the other thing I think, and this is also in relationship to this intergenerational, multi-generational healing, we are talking a lot about self-care. We are talking a lot about radical rest. The other piece of this puzzle is truly engaging in self-care and radical rest, not just talking about it. And it's not in this sort of, how do I say it? This sort of cliche way of, oh, you know, take care of yourself. Like we're using all these terms in ways that are just kind of cute and cliche. But it's really, again, back to this radical reimagining of understanding who we are as beings and what we need to be fueled and how we can last. And thinking about, especially as I've talked about capitalism sort of all the way through this, thinking about what divesting from capitalism really means. When we talk about divesting from capitalism, we are literally talking about rest. If you look at the history and the origins of capitalism and this concept of work and hard work and sort of pulling yourself up by our bootstraps and, you know, all of these concepts that sun up to sundown, all of these sort of concepts that mean that we are destroying our bodies, that we are destroying our spirits, our souls, right? We're telling young people now, you know, I was teaching, I had taught high school for 15 years. We're telling young people at the age of 13 and 14, they have to figure out what kind of college that they want to go to at that age. They have to line up all these AP and honors classes. They have to, you know, do 6 or 7 hours of homework at night after doing 6 and 7 hours of school every day. And then we're telling them that they're preparing to go into a college system that's going to put them in debt for the most part. And then maybe they might get a job. And then we're like, but rest. You've been stressing me out since I was born. You've been telling me I got to figure out what kind of job I want to get, what kind of school I want to go to, that I have to forego spending time with my family and my friends and being any kind of a social being or whole being by reading and doing math problems and all kinds of things. And now we have it Saturday schools. And now because we have the inability to radically reimagine schools, now we're just putting 6 or 7 hours of Zoom school on these same young folks. And we're like, but self-care though, get some rest. Your project is due on Monday. Your project is, but it's Friday. How is a project due on Monday? That means I'm working Saturday and Sunday. We got to start thinking about that. We got to start moving more intentionally. As a teacher, one of the challenges I always sort of had was balancing quality and quantity. How can I make sure that my students get what they need and that they don't have to be exhausted, right? How many of you learn, and I do wish we were in a room so I could see faces and hands, but how many of us learn under stress and exhaustion? You don't even learn that way. We learn when we're relaxed, when we feel safe, right? There's a level of focus that we can have when we're not worried, we're not, overwhelmed. The best learning conditions are actually learning conditions where folks engage in joy, where there's an exchange, right? It's not that rigor isn't present. So we have to even rethink our institutions. We're building mentoring programs in our higher ed institutions to remediate young folks because they maybe have not learned how to exhaust themselves. Oh, they're not ready for college level work because, they need to understand they need to be doing all of this work and they don't understand that they're not working hard enough. So we're building programs to remediate folks because we've normalized exhaustion as a part of the academic process. And then we're like, but self-care though, engage in self-care, take your time, get some rest. We're not doing what we're saying. Rigor can still happen when folks are rested and relaxed and engaged in joy. Rigor can still happen in the absence of 7-hour Zoom classes. Rigor can still happen in communities and in homes with collaborative models of education happening that include, one of the best things that happened, my last semester of teaching was on Zoom because of the pandemic. One of the best things that happened to me was teaching with little brothers and sisters climbing on the couch behind students and moms walking by and abuelas in the background cooking. That was one of the best experiences of teaching because I felt like I'm here teaching English. The whole family is involved. This is communal. And for Black and brown folks, that's how we do. But we've told them to leave those things behind to enter these spaces where they have to adapt to things that not only don't look like them, but don't function how their collectivist communities function. And then we just wear them out and wipe them out. And then we talk about retention at the next meeting and how we need to bring programs on campus to increase, because Black and brown folks are dropping out. They just can't cut it. No, they can cut it. We are doing our best to leave them, to keep them out of our systems. We're not reimagining. We're not thinking about what school should look like in the 21st century. We're not adjusting. We have to create those spaces, y'all. We have to do this work. We have to be aware. We have to move with intention. For those of us who already are constantly doing the critical interrogation, good. Next step, next levels. For those of us who are already thinking critically about youth centrism, good for you. Next levels. For those of us who are already sort of trying to shift institutions, great, amazing, good job. Here's your cookie. Next levels. We got 7 generations out to think about. This level is not going to be enough. We can build here. We got to do the work. Everything needs a foundation, but we always have to be thinking about next levels and not thinking about next level in terms of what we can do. When I'm thinking about next levels now, I'm thinking about next levels beyond me. My legacy and impact is not just about me. My legacy and impact is about all the young people and their young people and the young people after them and the young people after them and what they accomplished, because I maybe did a little bit of work with the time that I had. We got to think next levels. These young folks are ready. They are on fire. They have shown us they can organize, they can move. Thank God they did. Young people really did focus on the outcome of this last election. Young people did that work. They organized Black, brown, queer, trans folks at the community level. And they decided the outcome. Young folks know what needs to be done. Do they need guidance? Of course they do. Of course they do. For sure, they need support. But young people know what needs to be done. We have to get behind them. We have to get ourselves right and be ready to get behind them so that we can all move in to a more radical future, so that we can all move into a space where we are healing and we are whole, right? And we are reimagining and we are freedom dreaming. Young people teach us how to freedom dream. They remind us of what freedom dreaming looks like, what it meant to us. They don't know impossible, right? For them, this is the century of the iPhone. Everything is possible. You can Google it and figure it out, right? It's time for us to get to next levels. It's time for us to move with intention. And I'll end, as I always end with keynotes, by saying, young people deserve the absolute best of us so that they can be better than us. Thank you all for listening to me this morning.
Torie, that was absolutely incredible. It's like, wow, 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 wow. Yes, yes, preach, preach. And the comments were excellent. Thank you all for definitely adding things to the chat. Yes. And if, those of us that are panelists, we can definitely clap. And if somebody mentioned that throughout your presentation, we would have been standing just with ovation with all that you said and the comments that we definitely have. We actually have a few minutes. So if people want to put some questions in the Q&A for Torie, we have 10 minutes that we can get even further information from Torie before we move to the next levels. And Torie, just thank you for speaking.
I'm like, hey, I put my timer for 45 minutes. Was I too short?
Right. No, Herman actually ended 10 minutes short, so it was a gift. It gave us 10 extra minutes to have people throw some questions in the Q&A and see if we can get some more information. So feel free to add to the Q&A. And Torie, do you want me to read those or do you want to pull them up yourself?
Yeah, I'll see what I can. I mean, there's a ton of things coming through, so I'll see what I can find. Thank you all so much for the love and affirmation.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. But if anybody has any questions that you'd like to ask Torie, we've got 10 minutes that we could definitely take advantage of that. But yeah, definitely great affirmations, lots of appreciation.
Thank you all so much. Come back for an encore. All right, Tanya.
Yeah. Do you have an encore?
Me up.
Great, we do have a question. So who do you advise us, those interested in starting critical mentorships, have on our team?
That's a good question. So I think I always start with who I'm serving. So depending on who you are focused on serving, those are the folks that need to be on your team, right? So for us, that's young folks who are Black, brown, queer, trans. Those are the folks we always ask first before we do any work. And we not only do we ask them and listen to them, but then our next step is to say, can we now pay you to help us do this work? Because we know that you're the expert and you can help us do it. So when you think about who to put on your team, that's the go-to, is who are you serving? And then those are the folks who need to dictate their own programs and their own services. Thank you.
Or there's a question that came through the chat. Do you have any suggestions for changing the assimilationist culture of academia?
Whew.
Academia.
Paul, that's a rough one, but I mean, I would say we just have to keep, you know, one is divesting, right? We just have to stop participating in the things that are the most harmful. We just got to divest. I think that's number one. And I think the other thing we have to do is start, you know, really pushing. I mean, I left the high school classroom. I'm now teaching at a university, and you know, my number one goal in this university role is to be the opposite of what typical university professors are. And I'm pushing back a little bit. Like, you know, every time I get a chance, I've done even small things like I've designed a living syllabus, right? So that I don't have a syllabus of just all the stuff that I want my students to know. I invite them early on in the process to take part in contributing to the syllabus. And I try to open up my classroom space so that it is as much of an exchange as it is, you know, sort of me lecturing or talking, and we build a community of learning. And I mean, I think some of that also is just for me, maybe not being in higher ed forever. I mean, being a teacher for 15 years, you do have to learn how to teach differently. So maybe some of that is moving into my higher ed experience. But I think you just have to challenge things, right? And you just have to be. And sometimes you have to, I call it teaching out loud. Sometimes you have to explicitly say, this is why I'm doing this, right? I'm a sneakerhead. You know, hip hop, you could hear hip hop culture probably throughout my talk. And so I'm a big sneakerhead. I'm wearing J's like every day. When we were on campus, I was wearing J's, right? I don't shift to whatever professor look there is. And I talk about that out loud and say, like, this is who I am. This is my authentic self. And I'm explicitly sort of disrupting the norms of what a PhD should look like and behave like, right? So I think, you know, divesting from some of it and then being intentional about calling out and sort of, again, I call it teaching out loud, explicitly saying, this is why I'm doing this, to sort of disrupt respectability politics, et cetera, to open up conversations about that. Those, I mean, I think those are small things that we can begin to do. Obviously, the bigger things are, you know, we've got to start hiring differently. We've got to start sort of shifting the way institutions think, policy-wise, et cetera. But the small things we can do every day are some of the things I noted.
Sorry, didn't realize I was muted until I got the little box. You're muted. Sorry about that, everybody. We have a couple questions in the Q&A and one in the chat. So what are your thoughts about holding our schools and colleges and universities accountable?
Yeah. Whew. I think there needs to be more community involvement and you know, and again, in ways that we've not seen yet. And I keep kind of talking about divestment and abolition, and it doesn't mean that I want all of our institutions to go away, but in a capitalist system, I think sometimes that is the way that we can hold them accountable, by saying, if you don't create what we need, then we're going to create this alternative, right? I think the opportunity that we have right now in this pandemic is that we don't have to go back, right? We have this moment where we can reimagine and reframe and rebuild right now. You know, we don't, one of my frustrations with seeing how school just kind of carries on business as usual is that this is one of those opportunities where the universe has literally sat down, like, sit yourself down. And instead of taking that time and thinking, wow, this is an opportunity for us to really think about community schools, right? And what it means. Like, we're literally in people's kitchens via Zoom right now, and we're not thinking about the possibilities of teaching in community. So I think, like, right now, like in holding schools accountable, I think a lot of it is about noting what's going well in terms of how folks, like, homeschooling is on the increase right now, and people are thinking about all these alternative ways to be educated. I think we need to harness those, you know, and then hold the institutions accountable by saying, like, look, we've had a year of the pandemic to figure out what could work for our community. So if you can't do these things, then we're just going to build it over here.
So true. So another question, what are some of your strategies for navigating resistance when you are engaging in next level thinking?
Thank you. That's a self-care question all day. My strategies are meditation. You know, before I came to do this keynote this morning, I got up a little earlier and I do like a mindfulness workout meditation. And I've been just, you know, again, as a Black queer woman, recognizing that a lot of folks expect labor of me, I've had to be more intentional about taking care of me before I do, you know, commit to my day of labor, right? So I think just really taking care of yourself, really being mindful. For me, it's meditation. For me, it's trying to get some cardio in. I've also sort of done some fun things around my house just to help myself. We put a fountain in, so, you know, I could like sit by water and listen to it. My wife and I bought e-bikes, so we've just been going on these random rides, and they've been easier because we don't have to, you know, pull ourselves up the hills with an e-bike. So I think for me, it's really a matter of self-care and what works for you. Folks are going to resist, right? And we can do all the strategic things of consensus building and having conversations and all that. But I think the struggle with people resisting is the toll that it takes on you, right? As you're trying to sort of push. So for me, that's very much a self-care question, and just really thinking about how we can prepare ourselves and our bodies for a continual fight, because the fight ain't gonna go away, right?
Thank you, Torie. We have several more questions in the chat in the Q&A, but I'm just going to ask one that hopefully will take just about a minute, and then I'll direct people to breakouts. But this question is, do you need to be an experienced mentor or veteran, do you need to be an experienced educator, veteran of mentoring programs to be a mentor? Like, when can you call yourself a mentor?
Absolutely. If a young person chooses you, you're a mentor. That's really what it comes down to. So no, I don't think you have to be a veteran educator. You just have to be a person willing to share yourself and your experiences and your support with someone else.